The call came in for 2 pizzas to a remote TV transmission tower at the end of a dirt road. But Brian Wells didn't walk away with a tip. He walked away with a ticking time bomb locked around his neck. Click. That was the sound of heavy, industrial steel snapping shut around the throat of an unassuming delivery driver. He didn't know it yet, but he was no longer a free man. He was a disposable pawn in a sadistic scavenger hunt where the prize was his own life, and the game was rigged from the very first second. A hostage, a custom-made shotgun disguised as a walking cane, and a 9-page manifesto of impossible instructions. This is the Pizza Bomber, Heist, a crime so deeply bizarre it plays out like a deleted scene from a psychological thriller. But for Brian Wells, sitting entirely alone on the scorching Pennsylvania asphalt, the mechanical ticking against his chest was very, very real. He believed that if he just played by their rules, he could survive the afternoon. He was wrong. Erie, Pennsylvania, is a city that understands the heavy lingering weight of rust and long winters. But on the afternoon of August 28, 2003, there was no snow on the ground. The air was thick, humid, and suffocating. It was the kind of late summer day where the pavement shimmers with heat, and the sky feels like a pale, heavy blanket pressing down on the asphalt. For 46-year-old Brian Wells, it was supposed to be just another Thursday. Brian was a creature of absolute routine. He had worked as a delivery driver for Mamma Mia's Pizza for over a decade. He wasn't a man with grand sweeping ambitions. He lived alone with his cats, kept his head down, and found comfort in the predictable rhythm of his life. He knew every pothole, every shortcut, and every street lamp in Erie. He was the guy you called when you needed a reliable shift covered. He was quiet, unassuming, and entirely harmless. He was exactly the kind of man a predator looks for. At exactly 1:30 p.m., the phone at Mamma Mia's rang. The lunch rush had mostly died down. The kitchen smelled of baking dough and oregano, the cooling ovens ticking in the background. Tony, the manager, picked up the receiver, wiping his hands on an apron. Mamma Mia's. Pickup or delivery? The voice on the other end was muffled, speaking with a strange, deliberate cadence. The caller wanted 2 sausage and pepperoni pizzas. Address? Tony asked, grabbing a grease-stained pen. 8631 Peach Street. The voice replied. At the end of the dirt road. By the TV transmission tower. Tony frowned. Peach Street was a massive commercial artery, lined with car dealerships and strip malls. But the specific address the caller gave was bizarre. It wasn't a house or an office building. It was an access road that trailed off into a dense, unpaved stretch of woods. It was a dead end. Hey, Brian, Tony called out, tearing the ticket from the pad. Got a weird one for you. Out by the WCTV tower. Brian grabbed the ticket, his expression unreadable. He didn't complain. He simply grabbed the 2 flat, cardboard boxes, slid them into the insulated red delivery sleeve, and walked out into the blinding afternoon sun. He climbed into his dark green Chevrolet Geo Prism, rolled the windows down to fight the heat, and pulled out onto the road. He had exactly 1 hour left as a free man. The drive out to the transmission tower took Brian away from the bustling retail centers and into a canopy of thick, overgrown trees. The pavement cracked, bleeding into gravel, and finally gave way to a deeply rutted dirt road. The Geo Prism kicked up a cloud of dry, choking dust as it crawled toward the end of the line. At the end of the path, the massive steel legs of the TV tower loomed overhead, casting long, geometric shadows across a small clearing. Brian parked the car and killed the engine. The silence of the woods was immediate and unnerving. There was no house. No waiting customer. Just the rustle of dry leaves and the hum of insects. He stepped out of the car, holding the pizza bags. Hello? He called out, his voice swallowed by the dense tree line. Mamma Mia's? The trap snapped shut. Shadows detached from the tree line. 3 figures stepped out of the brush, their faces obscured, moving with a practiced terrifying calm. One of them held a shotgun. Another carried something heavy, metallic, and completely foreign. Drop the pizzas, Brian, a voice commanded. It was a sharp, gravelly tone that brooked no argument. Brian froze. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. The insulated bag slipped from his fingers, hitting the dirt with a soft thud. What is this? Brian stammered, raising his hands, his eyes darting between the men and the dark barrel of the gun. I don't have any cash. You can take the car. Take whatever you want. We don't want your car. the man with the heavy metal object said, stepping forward. "Put your hands on the hood." Now. The reality of the situation evaporated, replaced by a surreal waking nightmare. Brian was shoved against the hot metal of the geo-prism. Cold, unyielding steel was suddenly forced around his neck. Clack. The sound was heavy, metallic, and permanent. It was the sound of a heavy-duty padlock snapping shut. Brian gasped, reaching up to touch his throat. Locked tightly around his neck was a massive hinged metal collar. Attached to the collar was a bulky rectangular box that rested squarely against his chest. It was heavy, maybe 10 or 12 pounds. Wires snaked out from the corners. Dials and keyholes dotted the steel casing. "Do not pull on it," the leader warned, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Do not try to pry it open. There are 4 locks. There are tripwires. If you tamper with it, the explosives inside will detonate, and it will take your head clean off your shoulders." Brian's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. The metal was already growing hot against his skin in the August sun. "Please," he begged, tears welling in his eyes. "Why are you doing this?" "I'm just a delivery driver." "Because you're going to do exactly what we tell you," the man replied. He shoved 2 items into Brian's trembling hands. The first was a smooth, polished wooden cane. But as Brian gripped it, he realized it was far too heavy. The handle was modified, rigged with a hidden trigger mechanism. It was a custom-made, fully functional 12-gauge shotgun, disguised perfectly as a walking stick. The second item was a thick, multi-page document, meticulously handwritten in neat block lettering. "Those are your instructions," the man said, stepping back into the shadows. "You are now running against the clock. Do not call the police. Act now, think later, or you will die." The figures vanished back into the dense woods, leaving Brian completely alone in the clearing. The silence rushed back in, broken only by a sound that made Brian's blood run cold. Coming from the metal box resting on his chest, he heard a distinct mechanical tick. At 2:38 p.m., the automatic glass doors of the PNC Bank on Peach Street slid open. The blast of air conditioning was a sharp contrast to the blistering heat outside. Inside, the bank was quiet. A few tellers were counting drawers. A lone customer was filling out a deposit slip. Brian Wells walked through the doors. His posture was rigid, unnatural. He walked with a stiff, heavy gait, leaning slightly on a wooden cane. Underneath his shirt, a strange rectangular bulge protruded from his chest, distorting the fabric. Around his neck, the steel ring of the collar was clearly visible, glinting under the fluorescent lights. But the most jarring, surreal detail of all was his face. Brian was sweating profusely, his eyes wide and dilated with absolute panic. Yet, tucked casually into the corner of his mouth was a dum-dum lollipop. It was a bizarre, jarring juxtaposition, a man radiating the energy of a walking corpse, sucking on a piece of children's candy. He walked directly up to the teller window. He didn't shout. He didn't brandish a weapon in the air. He simply reached into his pocket with a trembling hand and slid a piece of paper across the polished marble counter. The teller, a young woman who had been absent-mindedly sorting checks, looked down at the note. It was handwritten, the letters blocky and aggressive. "Gather employees with access codes to vault and work fast to fill bag with $250,000. You have only 15 minutes. If police are notified or anyone flees, a bomb will detonate." The teller looked up, the color completely draining from her face. She looked at the steel ring locked tightly around Brian's neck. She looked at the strange bulky square hidden beneath his shirt. I can't," she stammered, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "The vault is on a time delay. I physically cannot get that much money out right now." Brian's eyes widened further, the panic threatening to completely consume him. He leaned forward, tapping the top of the marble counter with the heavy wooden cane. "You have to," Brian pleaded, his voice cracking, the lollipop stick bobbing in his mouth. "Please. I only have 15 minutes. They gave me 15 minutes. The bank manager, sensing the sudden unnatural tension at the window, stepped over. One look at the steel collar, and the note was all it took. He pressed the silent alarm under the desk. "Sir," the manager said, keeping his voice incredibly level, "we cannot access the vault, but we will give you everything we have in the drawers. Okay? Just stay calm." Brian nodded frantically. "Hurry. Please, you have to hurry." The tellers scrambled, pulling stacks of cash from their tills. It wasn't anywhere near the $250,000 demanded. They shoved exactly $8,702 into a canvas bag and handed it across the counter. Brian snatched the bag. He didn't count it. He didn't argue. He turned and bolted toward the exit, his stiff, heavy gait transforming into a panicked sprint. He burst through the glass doors and back out into the blinding August heat, clutching the canvas bag and the wooden cane. He had completed step 1 of the instructions. But the clock inside the metal box was still ticking, and the real nightmare was only just beginning. The heat radiating from the asphalt of the PNC Bank parking lot felt like an open oven, but as Brian Wells sprinted back to his green Chevrolet Geo Prism, he was shivering. A cold, dread-inducing sweat soaked through his shirt. He tossed the canvas bag containing $8,702 onto the passenger seat. It landed with a dull thud, right next to the shotgun disguised as a walking cane. He slammed the driver's side door shut, his hands shaking so violently he could barely get the key into the ignition. Around his neck, the heavy steel collar dug mercilessly into his collarbone. Beneath his shirt, the metallic box pressed against his sternum. Tick, tick, tick. Brian reached for the multi-page manuscript the men in the woods had forced into his hands. The pages were covered in neat, meticulous, almost architectural handwriting. The instructions did not read like a simple ransom note. They read like the rules of a twisted, sadistic board game. The margins were filled with elaborate diagrams and strict warnings. This booby trap can be removed only by following our instructions. The first page read in bold, black ink. Act now, think later, or you will die. Brian's eyes darted frantically across the text. The people who locked the collar around his neck had promised him that if he completed a specific sequence of tasks, he would gather a series of keys. Those keys, when used in the correct order, would unlock the padlock and disarm the explosives before the timer hit 0. He just needed to follow the rules. He just needed to play their game. The first instruction told him to exit the bank and drive to the McDonald's restaurant right next door. He was to go to the drive-through lane, locate a specific flower bed, and look under a rock with a piece of white tape on it. Brian threw the car into drive and slammed on the gas. He tore out of the bank parking lot and skidded into the McDonald's drive-through. He didn't care who saw him. He threw the car into park, stumbled out into the humidity, and dropped to his knees in the mulch. He clawed at the dirt, tossing rocks aside until his fingers brushed against a folded piece of paper hidden beneath a stone. He ripped it open. It was a 2-page note, demanding he drive a few miles up Peach Street to a wooded area near an intersection. Once there, he was supposed to find a jar hidden in the brush. The jar would contain the next set of instructions and, hopefully, the first key to the heavy metal lock digging into his throat. Welcome to the Heist Vault. Behind every heist there's a story. Some end in prisons. Some end in graves. And some simply disappear. Brian scrambled back into the Geo Prism. He wiped the stinging sweat from his eyes, threw the car in gear, and peeled out onto the main road. He actually believed he could win. He believed that if he drove fast enough, if he followed every instruction to the letter, he could survive the afternoon and go back to his quiet life, his cats, and his pizza deliveries. What Brian didn't know was that the men in the woods were master manipulators. The game was rigged. The time limits they had set in the instructions were physically impossible to meet. They had given him a scavenger hunt he could never finish, designed specifically to keep him busy, keep him panicked, and keep him away from them while they vanished into the ether. While Brian was digging through the mulch at McDonald's, the Erie police dispatch radios crackled to life. All units, 211 in progress at the PNC Bank on Peach Street. Suspect is a white male, mid-40s, driving a green Geo Prism. Suspect claims to have an explosive device strapped to his chest. Pennsylvania state troopers were already patrolling the commercial artery. Within moments of the broadcast, a marked cruiser spotted the dark green Geo Prism speeding erratically away from the McDonald's. The cruiser's lights flared, a blinding wash of red and blue reflecting in Brian's rearview mirror. The siren wailed, piercing the heavy summer air. If Brian were a hardened bank robber, this is the moment a high-speed chase would begin. He would have floored the accelerator, swerving through traffic, desperate to escape. But Brian wasn't a bank robber. He was a pizza delivery man trapped in a nightmare. The moment he saw the flashing lights, an overwhelming wave of relief actually washed over him. The police were here. The police could help him. They could call the bomb squad. They could use their bolt cutters. They could stop the ticking. Brian hit his blinker. He smoothly pulled his car into the paved parking lot of an eyeglass hut, brought the vehicle to a complete stop, and killed the engine. The state troopers pulled up behind him, drawing their sidearms before their boots even hit the pavement. "Step out of the vehicle!" the lead trooper bellowed, using the door of his cruiser for cover. "Keep your hands where I can see them!" Brian pushed his car door open. He stepped out onto the hot asphalt, his hands raised above his head. In one hand, he still clutched the canvas bag of stolen cash. In the other, he held the wooden cane. "Drop the weapon!" the officers screamed, their guns trained squarely on his chest. Brian immediately opened his hands. The bag of money hit the ground. The shotgun cane clattered onto the pavement, rolling a few inches away from his sneakers. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply stood there in the blistering heat, raising his chin so the officers could see the heavy, industrial steel ring locked around his neck. "It's not me!" Brian yelled, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "I didn't do it! There's a bomb! They locked it on me! It's going to go off!" The troopers froze. In their years on the force, they had seen armed robberies, domestic disputes, and high-speed pursuits. But they had never seen a human being wearing an improvised explosive device like a twisted necklace. The protocols for a hostage situation and a bomb threat fiercely collided. The troopers couldn't rush forward to help him, but they also couldn't treat him like a standard suspect. "Get on the ground!" the trooper yelled, stepping back to increase the blast radius distance. "Sit down on the pavement! Do not touch your chest!" Brian complied instantly. He folded his legs and sat cross-legged on the scorching blacktop of the eyeglass hut parking lot. More police cruisers arrived, their sirens wailing, sealing off the exits. Local news vans, monitoring the police scanners, began pulling into adjacent lots, setting up long-lens cameras to capture the surreal standoff. The minutes that followed were a masterclass in psychological torture. The police established a wide perimeter, crouching behind the engine blocks of their cruisers, their weapons drawn but entirely useless against the metal box strapped to the pizza man's chest. They called for the bomb squad, but the nearest explosive ordnance disposal, Erie, team was stationed in a neighboring county, miles away, battling through midday traffic. Brian sat alone in the center of the asphalt. The sun beat down mercilessly. "Please," Brian pleaded, his voice carrying across the empty parking lot. "Why is nobody helping me? Did you call my boss? Call Tony at Mamma Mia's. I'm just a delivery guy. They forced me to do it. 3 men. Black men. They pulled me out of my car in the woods and locked this thing on me." The troopers tried to keep him calm, shouting reassurances from behind their cars. "The bomb squad is on the way, Brian. Just stay still. Do not touch the device." But Brian could hear something the officers couldn't. Tick. 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 The mechanical rhythm inside the metal box was accelerating. It wasn't just a simple alarm clock. The device was a highly complex diabolical piece of engineering. The bomb makers had constructed a triple-layered explosive mechanism, utilizing electronic kitchen timers, multiple tripwires, and 2 powerful pipe bombs packed tightly with smokeless powder and heavy metal ball bearings, designed to act as deadly shrapnel. "It's going to go off," Brian said, the frantic energy leaving his voice, replaced by a hollow, chilling resignation. "I don't have much time." He shifted his weight on the burning pavement. He looked around at the ring of police cars, the flashing lights, the news cameras zooming in on his face. He was surrounded by dozens of people, but he had never been more entirely hopelessly alone. "Does anyone have a key?" he shouted, begging the men with guns to perform a miracle. "Please! It hurts. It's so heavy." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the handwritten instructions, desperately scanning the pages one last time, hoping he had missed a hidden clue, a master password, anything that could stop the inevitable. But the pages offered no mercy. They just mocked him with their impossible scavenger hunt. At 3:15 p.m., Brian Wells realized the bomb squad was not going to make it in time. The mechanical ticking inside the box reached a frantic overlapping crescendo. A high-pitched electronic warning beep pierced the humid air. "It's beeping," Brian called out, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. He dropped the papers. He leaned back slightly, closing his eyes, bracing himself against the inevitable. "It's going to." At 3:18 p.m., the collar bomb detonated. The blast was sudden, brutal, and deafening. It tore through the heavy summer air with a concussive shockwave that rattled the windows of the nearby businesses. A thick plume of gray acrid smoke instantly enveloped Brian. The sound echoed off the strip mall facades, a sharp violent crack that silenced the entire city block. Behind the police cruisers, the troopers ducked, shielding their faces as pieces of metal shrapnel and plastic debris rained down across the parking lot. When the smoke finally began to clear, slowly drifting away on the hot breeze, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the perimeter. The flashing red and blue lights of the cruisers cut through the haze, illuminating the grisly aftermath. Brian Wells fell backward onto the asphalt. The explosive charge had blasted a fatal hole through his chest, directly over his heart. He gasped for air, his body entirely in shock, the life rapidly draining from him on the searing pavement. A few minutes later, the wail of approaching sirens heralded the arrival of the bomb squad. They jumped out of their armored trucks in heavy Kevlar blast suits, rushing toward the center of the lot. But it was far too late. There was nothing left to disarm. There was no life left to save. The pizza delivery man was gone, taking the answers to the scavenger hunt with him into the grave. For the police and the FBI agents arriving at the scene, the explosion was not the end of the crisis. It was the horrifying beginning of the most complex, twisted investigation in the history of the Bureau. They approached the body with extreme caution. The collar was still locked tightly around Brian's neck. The bomb squad had to use heavy-duty hydraulic rescue tools, the jaws of life, to carefully pry the steel ring apart, fearing a secondary delayed explosive charge might still be hidden within the casing. Once the device was removed and the scene was deemed safe, investigators began gathering the evidence scattered across the asphalt. They picked up the smooth wooden cane. When they unscrewed the top, they found a perfectly machined spring-loaded firing pin and a live 12-gauge shotgun shell. It was a weapon straight out of a spy novel, crafted with a level of mechanical skill that baffled the local detectives. Then, they found the 9-page manuscript. FBI agents carefully placed the handwritten pages into clear evidence bags. As they read the block lettering, a dark, unsettling realization began to wash over them. This was not a standard bank robbery gone wrong. This was a highly orchestrated, multi-layered conspiracy. The notes taunted the police. They included intricate drawings of the bomb. They directed Brian on a wild goose chase through the woods, assigning him to collect keys that, the investigators soon realized, would never have actually unlocked the collar in time. The entire event was a theatrical, sadistic performance. The bomb makers didn't just want the money from the bank. They wanted to watch a human being jump through hoops for his life. They wanted to watch him die on live television. "Who does this?" a local detective whispered, staring at the shattered remains of the metal box. "Who builds a shotgun into a walking cane, writes a scavenger hunt, and locks a bomb to a pizza guy's neck?" The answer to that question would take federal investigators down a rabbit hole of absolute madness. It would lead them away from the sun-baked parking lot and into the filthy, hoarder-filled homes of Erie's most bizarre residents. It would introduce them to a narcissistic mastermind who thought she was the smartest woman in the world, a brilliant but deeply disturbed handyman, and a frozen human corpse stuffed into a chest freezer just miles away from the bank. The investigation was about to reveal that Brian Wells was not just a random victim pulled out of a pizza shop. He was a tragic pawn in a game played by monsters hiding in plain sight. The FBI agents standing over the shattered remnants of the collar bomb had a 9-page manifesto in their hands. But they had absolutely no suspects. In the immediate hours following the explosion, the investigators decided to do the only thing they could: they ran the maze. They wanted to know if Brian Wells ever actually had a chance, or if he was always destined to die on that scorching asphalt. Following the meticulous block-lettered instructions, agents drove from the McDonald's flower bed out to a wooded intersection a few miles down Peach Street. Hidden in the brush, exactly where the note said it would be, they found a glass jar. Inside the jar was the next clue. That clue directed them to a road sign 2 miles away. They drove there, found the hidden marker, and read the next set of instructions, which pointed them to yet another location. As the agents drove the route, stopwatch in hand, a chilling realization settled over the vehicle. The timeline was a complete physical impossibility. Even if Brian had driven flawlessly, hitting every green light, and instantly finding every hidden jar without hesitation, the sheer driving distance required to collect all the keys vastly exceeded the time on the bomb's countdown clock. The scavenger hunt was a sadistic illusion. The bomb makers never intended for the pizza delivery man to survive. He was a disposable pack mule, meant to fetch the money, get distracted by a frantic hunt through the woods, and die in an explosion that would destroy the physical evidence and tie up the police while the real thieves slipped away with the cash. But if Brian was strapped to a bomb with an impossible countdown, how were the masterminds actually supposed to collect the $250,000 they demanded? The answer lay in the sinister geography of the scavenger hunt. The 9-page manuscript wasn't just designed to keep Brian panicked, it was designed to isolate him. The instructions forced him to drive out of the heavily populated commercial districts and into increasingly secluded, wooded areas around Erie. While Brian was frantically driving from clue to clue, the conspirators were allegedly tailing him from a safe distance in a shadow car. One of the later steps in the scavenger hunt, which Brian never reached, would have required him to leave the canvas bag of money at a specific, isolated drop point in the woods in order to retrieve the next key. Once Brian dropped the money, he would drive away to his next location, desperately chasing a key that didn't exist. The conspirators would simply pull up to the drop site, grab the bag of cash, and vanish. When the bomb eventually detonated, it would kill their only witness and leave the police with absolutely no trail to the money. The entire plan completely unraveled only because Brian panicked, drove erratically, and drew the attention of the state troopers. Surrounded by police in a highly visible parking lot, the conspirators could not approach him to take the cash. They had to cut their losses and disappear empty-handed, leaving them desperate, paranoid, and turning on each other. And the masterminds made one other critical, geographical mistake. The investigation naturally zeroed in on the location where Brian Wells was ambushed, the dirt road leading to the WCTV transmission tower. Agents combed the dense woods, searching for footprints, tire tracks, or discarded tools. But what caught their attention wasn't in the woods. It was the property directly adjacent to the clearing. Sitting at the end of the dirt path, sharing a property line with the TV tower, was a dilapidated, overgrown house. It belonged to a 60-year-old man named Bill Rothstein. Rothstein was a local eccentric. He was a brilliant but incredibly strange handyman, a former high school shop teacher who spoke 3 languages and possessed a genius-level IQ. His property was a chaotic junkyard of rusted cars, scrap metal, and heavy machinery. Inside, his house was a hoarder's nightmare, stacked floor to ceiling with garbage, old electronics, and woodworking tools. To the FBI, Rothstein was the perfect suspect. The collar bomb and the shotgun cane were not built by amateurs. They were constructed by someone with high-level machining skills, access to welding equipment, and a deep understanding of mechanical engineering. Rothstein fit the profile flawlessly. When agents interviewed him, Rothstein was incredibly calm, arrogant, and highly cooperative. He freely admitted that he lived next to the TV tower, but he swore he hadn't seen anything unusual on the day of the robbery. He played the part of the harmless, quirky neighbor perfectly. With no physical evidence tying him directly to the bomb, the FBI had to leave him alone. The trail went ice cold. For 3 agonizing weeks, the city of Erie lived in a state of high paranoia, wondering if a bomb-making madman was still walking their streets. Then, on September 20th, 2003, the Erie Police Department received a bizarre phone call. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, almost academic. It was Bill Rothstein. At 8645 Peach Street. Rothstein told the 911 dispatcher, reciting his own home address. There is a frozen body in a freezer. When police arrived at Rothstein's junkyard property, he was waiting for them. He led the officers through the labyrinth of hoarded garbage in his home, pointing them toward a large chest freezer humming quietly in the corner of his garage. Inside the freezer, wrapped tightly in a tarp, was the fully intact frozen corpse of a man named Jim Roden. Rothstein raised his hands. He immediately confessed to hiding the body, but he vehemently denied pulling the trigger. He told the police a wild, sprawling story to shift the blame. He claimed the murder had been committed by a woman named Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong. According to Rothstein, Marjorie had shot Jim Roden, who was her live-in boyfriend, in the back with a shotgun during a domestic dispute weeks earlier. Marjorie had then called Rothstein, begging him for help. She offered to pay him $2,000 to clean up the crime scene, hide the body, and melt the murder weapon down with a blowtorch. Rothstein claimed he had initially agreed, hiding the corpse in his freezer. But the guilt had become too much. He told police he had even drafted a suicide note, preparing to end his own life because he couldn't live with the secret. When he couldn't pull the trigger on himself, he decided to call 911. But why would a criminal mastermind, who just successfully built an untraceable collar bomb, voluntarily call the police to report a frozen corpse in his own garage? It was a calculated move born of absolute paranoia and self-preservation. Bill Rothstein was a genius, but he knew exactly what kind of monster he was dealing with in Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong. Following the botched bank robbery, the tension between the conspirators skyrocketed. They hadn't gotten the money, the FBI was swarming the city, and they had a rotting corpse in a chest freezer tying them to the timeline. Rothstein did the math and realized two terrifying things. First, he was the ultimate loose end. He firmly believed Marjorie was eventually going to murder him to keep him quiet about the collar bomb. Second, he was the perfect fall guy. If the police found the body on their own, Marjorie would easily flip the script and blame the entire murder and the bank robbery on him. Rothstein called 911 as a preemptive strike to control the narrative. By voluntarily turning over the body of Jim Roden, Rothstein got to tell his version of the story first. He threw Marjorie to the wolves for the domestic murder, hoping to keep the police so distracted by the homicide that they wouldn't connect the frozen corpse to the pizza bomber case. For a while, his brilliantly manipulative strategy worked flawlessly. The police arrested Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong for the murder of Jim Roden. To the local media, it looked like a completely separate, unrelated tragedy, a domestic homicide hiding in a freezer, miles away from the PNC Bank. But the federal agents investigating the collar bomb did not believe in coincidences. A highly complex bank robbery happens at the TV tower. 3 weeks later, the guy living next door to the TV tower calls the cops to report a frozen body in his garage, murdered with a shotgun, the exact same type of weapon Brian Wells carried into the bank. The two crimes were connected. The FBI just needed to figure out how. And to do that, they had to understand the chaotic, brilliant, and incredibly dangerous mind of Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong. If Bill Rothstein was the mechanic of the operation, Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong was the venom. In her youth, Marjorie had been a local beauty queen in Erie. She possessed a high intellect, holding a master's degree, and boasting an encyclopedic memory. But her brilliance was deeply overshadowed by severe untreated mental illness. She suffered from bipolar disorder and extreme narcissism, rapidly shifting from highly articulate and charming to violently aggressive and deeply paranoid. She also had a very unsettling habit. The men in her life had a tendency to die. Before Jim Roden ended up in a chest freezer, Marjorie had already been involved in the deaths of 2 other romantic partners. In 1984, she shot her boyfriend Robert Thomas 6 times as he slept on her couch. She claimed self-defense and was acquitted by a jury. Years later, another fiancé died of a cerebral hemorrhage under highly suspicious circumstances, though Marjorie was never charged. She believed she was the smartest person in any room, and she believed she could outsmart the law. When the FBI began interrogating Marjorie in prison, she treated the interviews like a game of chess. She was arrogant, combative, and manipulative. She denied having anything to do with the collar bomb, but she constantly slipped up, offering bizarrely specific details about the bank robbery that had never been released to the public. Slowly, over months of exhausting interviews, cellmate confessions, and forensic analysis of Rothstein's workshop, the FBI pieced together the sinister puzzle. Marjorie had a motive for the bank robbery. She was incredibly greedy, and she was desperate for cash. She wanted to hire a hitman to murder her own father so she could prematurely inherit his $2 million estate. But hitmen require upfront payment. She didn't have the cash, so she pitched a plan to her old friend and former lover, the brilliant handyman Bill Rothstein. They would build an inescapable bomb, lock it onto a hostage, and force him to rob a bank for them. There was just one massive, horrifying wrinkle in their plan. Jim Roden, Marjorie's boyfriend, found out about the collar bomb plot. He threatened to go to the police and blow the whistle on the entire operation. Marjorie couldn't let that happen. The robbery was too important. So, she grabbed a shotgun, murdered Roden to keep him quiet, and called Rothstein to help stuff the body into the freezer. The frozen corpse wasn't a separate crime. It was the brutal, bloody preamble to the bank heist. The masterminds were locked in. The bomb was built. They had a dead body in the garage, and they were fully committed to the robbery. Now, they just needed a victim. They needed someone gullible, someone they could easily control. They needed a pizza delivery man. For months, the public had viewed Brian Wells exclusively as a tragic innocent victim, a man who was simply delivering a pizza to the wrong place at the wrong time. The idea that a hard-working, quiet man could be snatched off the street and strapped with explosives fueled the city's deepest anxieties. But as the FBI dug deeper into the lives of Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong and Bill Rothstein, they uncovered a dark, uncomfortable truth. To pull off a heist this complex, Marjorie and Bill needed a specific kind of pawn, They needed someone docile, someone easily manipulated, and most importantly, someone who would willingly walk into the bank. Snatching a random stranger off the street was too unpredictable. A stranger might fight back, panic, or run to the police immediately. They needed someone on the inside. The connective tissue between the brilliant narcissistic mastermind and the quiet pizza delivery driver was a man named Kenneth Barnes. Barnes was a local ex-convict, a drug dealer, and an old fishing buddy of Marjorie's. He was the man Marjorie had initially approached about murdering her father. Barnes also happened to be heavily involved with a local sex worker named Jessica Hoopsick. Hoopsick had a regular client who visited her weekly, bringing her money and occasionally paying for her groceries. That client was Brian Wells. According to the federal indictment and the testimonies that followed, Barnes and Marjorie used Hoopsick to draw Brian into the conspiracy. They didn't pitch him a hostage situation. They pitched him a foolproof, completely victimless crime. The plan they sold to Brian was remarkably simple. They told him they were going to build a fake bomb. He would put the decoy device on, walk into the bank, and hand the teller a threatening note. He would collect $250,000, walk out, and hand the money over to the crew. When the police eventually caught up with him, Brian was instructed to play the ultimate victim card. He would point to the fake bomb and the intricate handwritten scavenger hunt, claiming he had been ambushed and forced into the robbery against his will. The police would treat him as a hostage, the real thieves would walk away with the money, and Brian would secretly receive a substantial cut of the profits for playing his part. For a lonely man living a highly repetitive low-income life, the promise of easy money and a flawless alibi must have been intoxicating. Brian agreed to participate. He drove out to the WCTV transmission tower on August 28, fully expecting a dress rehearsal. He walked into the clearing anticipating a prop collar and a fake explosive. But Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong and Bill Rothstein had zero intention of leaving loose ends. When Brian stepped out of his green geoprism, the reality of the situation crashed down on him. The metal collar they presented wasn't plastic. It was heavy industrial steel. The box didn't look like a prop. It was wired with multiple trip mechanisms and packed tightly with live explosives. Brian realized, in a single chilling moment of clarity, that he was not a co-conspirator. He was the mark. Witnesses later testified that Brian tried to back out. He tried to run. But he was surrounded by armed, desperate people who had already murdered one man to keep the plot secret. One of the conspirators raised a gun and pointed it directly at his head. They forced him against the hood of his car and locked the steel collar around his throat, sealing his fate. This grim revelation perfectly explained Brian's bizarre behavior inside the bank. He was walking a tightrope of absolute panic. He had initially agreed to be there, but the lethal reality of the bomb had turned a fantasy heist into a waking nightmare. He supped on the dum-dum lollipop to ground himself, a desperate psychological anchor while his world completely unraveled. Building a federal case of this magnitude takes years. The FBI had to sift through mountains of hoarded garbage at Rothstein's house, secure wiretaps, and flip low-level associates to testify against the masterminds. But justice is rarely perfect. Bill Rothstein, the brilliant mechanic who engineered the collar bomb and hid a corpse in his freezer, never saw the inside of a courtroom. In the summer of 2004, just months after the investigation began closing in on him, Rothstein was diagnosed with aggressive non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. He rapidly deteriorated, taking his secrets, his exact role in building the explosives, and his final arrogant smirks to the grave. He died in a hospital bed, effectively escaping the federal government. With Rothstein dead, the full weight of the prosecution fell squarely onto the shoulders of Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong. It took 7 years to bring the mastermind to trial. Marjorie's defense team repeatedly argued that she was mentally unfit to stand trial, citing her bipolar disorder and erratic behavior. She underwent intense psychiatric treatments until a federal judge finally ruled her competent. In the fall of 2010, the trial commenced, and it quickly devolved into an absolute circus. Kenneth Barnes, the ex-convict who helped recruit Brian, had already pleaded guilty to his role in the conspiracy. Facing a massive prison sentence, Barnes flipped on his old friend. He took the stand and laid out the entire plot in agonizing detail, placing Marjorie at the absolute center of the web. He testified that she was the one who measured Brian's neck for the collar. She was the one who drafted the sadistic scavenger hunt. She was the one who dictated every move. The defense tried to paint Marjorie as a victim of Rothstein's manipulation, a sick woman who had been bullied by a smarter, crueler man. But Marjorie's ultimate downfall was her own tall ego. Against the desperate advice of her attorneys, Marjorie demanded to take the stand in her own defense. She believed, as she always had, that she was the smartest person in the room. She thought she could outtalk the federal prosecutors, charm the jury, and talk her way out of a life sentence. Instead, she spent nearly 6 hours on the witness stand delivering a chaotic rambling and deeply combative monologue. She insulted her own lawyers, sparred aggressively with the prosecutors, and constantly contradicted herself. Her narcissism was on full display. She didn't look like a manipulated victim. She looked exactly like a volatile, deeply manipulative predator, who was furious she was finally being held accountable. The jury deliberated for a remarkably short amount of time. They found Marjorie Diehl-Armstrong guilty of conspiracy to commit bank robbery, armed bank robbery, and using a destructive device in a crime of violence. The judge handed down a sentence of life in federal prison, plus 30 consecutive years, ensuring she would never breathe free air again. Marjorie died of breast cancer in a Texas federal medical center in 2017, taking her final breaths behind bars. Kenneth Barnes remained in prison until his death. The perpetrators of the most elaborate bank robbery in American history had all met grim, isolated ends. But the closure of the case offered very little comfort to the city of Erie. The pizza bomber heist remains a chilling reminder of how deeply twisted the human mind can become when fueled by greed and arrogance. It was a crime entirely devoid of the cinematic romance usually associated with bank robberies. There were no gentlemen thieves in tailored suits. There was no elegant hacking of a mainframe. There was only a brilliant mentally disturbed woman, an arrogant mechanic, and a quiet pizza delivery man who thought he was walking into a victimless crime, only to find himself chained to a live explosive on a sweltering afternoon. It proved that the most dangerous weapon in a robbery isn't a vault drill or a high-powered rifle. The most dangerous weapon is the ruthless willingness to view another human being not as a person, but as a disposable puzzle piece. Brian Wells died alone on the blazing asphalt of a Pennsylvania parking lot, chasing a set of keys that were never meant to save him. This is the Heist Vault. Subscribe for more true heists and robberies.